The storm had followed him for years. Not the kind you see, but the kind that lives inside a man. On a frozen West Virginia highway, Jake Morgan's truck gave out, and so did the last of his luck. Then came the letter, a notice ordering him back to Morgan Hill, the place where his brother died, and his life stopped. 10 years of silence, 10 winters of guilt. But why now? Why send him back to the ashes he'd spent a lifetime running from? What he'd find there, with a loyal dog named Shadow, wouldn't erase the past, but it would rebuild a man the world had already given up on. Before we begin, where are you watching from tonight? Drop your city in the comments and hit subscribe if you still believe in second chances. Snow drifted through Knoxville like falling dust from a forgotten sky, turning the morning into a pale haze. The city seemed half asleep, wrapped in its own breath. Inside a small woodworking shop at the edge of town, the scent of pine and machine oil mixed with the hum of saws. Jake Morgan, 46, worked alone near the back, sanding a table leg until the wood felt like silk beneath his calloused hands. He moved with the care of someone who needed control, not out of pride, but survival. His hazel hair was clipped short, streaked with early silver at the temples. A thin beard traced his jawline, just enough to soften the angles of his face. He looked strong, but not invincible. The way men look after life has tested them more than once. The shop was warm, yet Jake's fingers twitched occasionally, as if feeling something colder. He flinched at the slam of a toolbox lid across the room, the sound cutting sharper than it should. He forced a slow breath, grounding himself the way his therapist once taught him. Name what you see. Feel what's real. He mouthed the words silently. Wood, dust, light, air. Then came the noise. A power saw screamed to life behind him, the pitch like an explosion tearing open the air. The smell of burned resin struck like cordite. For one disorienting second, Jake wasn't in Tennessee anymore. The shop dissolved. He was crouched in a desert, heat pressing his skin, a boy yelling orders over radio static, gunfire splitting sky from sand. His body reacted before thought could intervene, a reflex honed by years of survival. He turned sharply, elbow catching a plank that tumbled into the next bench. Tommy, a skinny kid of 20 with restless hands and paint-splattered jeans, cried out as the board struck his wrist. "Jesus, man!" Tommy stumbled back, clutching his arm. The noise in Jake's head broke like glass. He froze, chest rising fast. Around him, the other workers stared, machines slowly winding down. The foreman, Ed Carson, pushed through the sawdust haze. A broad-shouldered man in his 50s with the calm, heavy walk of someone who'd done this all his life. "Jake, what the hell happened?" Jake swallowed, voice low. "My fault. I moved too fast." Tommy flexed his wrist, grimacing. Ed sighed, eyes narrowing. Not angry, more weary. He'd been a Marine once. He recognized that faraway look. Still, policy was policy. By afternoon, Jake sat in the small office by the window while Ed slid an envelope across the desk. "Owner says we gotta let you go," Ed said gently. "They like you, Jake. You just scare the insurance guy." Jake managed a nod. "Tell Tommy I'll cover the doctor bill." Ed hesitated. "You don't have to." "I do." By dusk, the shop lights went out one by one, and Jake stepped into the snow. The sky was bruised purple, the air metallic. He stood a moment in the alley, hands in his jacket pockets, watching his breath drift upward. Inside him, something long familiar whispered again. "You don't belong anywhere for long, do you?" His old pickup waited by the curb, engine idling rough. Shadow, his German shepherd, sat upright in the passenger seat. The dog's coat gleamed black and tan beneath the flickering streetlight. 6 years old, trained, loyal, disciplined. Once, in Kunar province, Shadow had dragged a wounded soldier from the rubble while Jake held off fire. That dog had seen as much of war as any man. Now, his amber eyes watched Jake like a sentinel guarding something broken but still breathing. Jake reached over, rubbing the dog's ear. "You hungry?" Shadow tilted his head, a small sound rising in his throat, something between a sigh and a question. Jake smiled faintly. "Yeah, me too." Home wasn't far, a tired little house with peeling paint and a sagging porch, wedged between a scrapyard and a pawn shop. Inside, the air was cold, the silence heavier than the walls. He set down his tool bag, then noticed the pile of mail on the counter. Bills, medical statements. One envelope marked "Final Notice." He opened it, skimmed, folded it again without reading the total. His eyes caught the corner of a picture frame leaning against the wall. Himself, Sarah, and Shadow as a puppy. Sarah's auburn hair glowed against the sunlight in the photo, her green eyes smiling in a way she hadn't for years before she left. She'd been patient longer than he deserved. Her leaving hadn't been a betrayal, just gravity pulling her toward the life she still wanted. The heater clicked on with a hollow groan. Jake sat at the kitchen table, rubbing his temples. A tremor passed through his fingers. He wasn't shaking from cold. It was the familiar tremor of a mind caught between memories it can't shut off, and a future too empty to imagine. A knock came at the door, not urgent, just official. A man in a gray overcoat, clipboard in hand. "Mr. Morgan, Wells Ridge Bank, need your signature confirming receipt." Jake signed, thanked him, closed the door. The envelope was thick. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he poured a cup of stale coffee, sat down again, and listened to the wind crawl under the eaves. When he finally slit the seal, the words were clean, cold, and final. Eviction effective in 14 days. His jaw tightened. The letter trembled slightly in his hand before he set it aside with quiet precision. Shadow came to sit beside him, pressing his head under Jake's palm. The warmth steadied him. Hours passed in half light. Jake packed 2 duffel bags, one for tools, one for clothes. He found the old dog tags he'd stopped wearing, rubbed them between his fingers until the metal warmed. He clipped Shadow's leash, looked around once more. There was nothing left here that could be called his. The road north out of Knoxville was quiet, a river of snow bending through darkness. Streetlights blurred into gold streaks against the windshield. Shadow sat tall, eyes fixed ahead, the faint reflection of headlights glimmering in his pupils. "You and me again," Jake said softly. The dog's tail brushed the seat once, a small sound in the vast silence. Outside, the storm began to fall heavier, flakes gathering like ash over the highway. Jake's hands tightened on the wheel. He didn't know where they were going, only that forward was all that was left. Behind him, the city disappeared into the storm. Ahead, somewhere in the frozen miles between memory and mercy, waited a place he hadn't seen in years, Morgan Hill. Snow fell in thin veils across the Appalachian Highway, soft enough to blur the edges of the world. The air was dry and sharp, the kind that turned breath into a small ghost with every exhale. Inside the old Chevy pickup, the heater wheezed faintly, struggling to push warmth through the frost-cracked vents. Jake Morgan kept one hand steady on the wheel, the other resting absently on the dog beside him. Shadow sat alert, his gold eyes following the road ahead, fur dusted with bits of snow that caught the pale light like ash. They'd been driving north since dawn, the world narrowing into silence. The hum of tires was the only sound. Then the truck gave a deep, tired cough and sputtered out. Jake coasted to the shoulder and tried the ignition twice, but the engine answered with a sound that could only mean surrender. He leaned back and sighed. "That's it, old man." Shadow turned his head, one ear pricked up. Jake grinned weakly. "Yeah, I know. Should've listened when the battery light came on." He stepped out into the cold, boots crunching on the frozen gravel. The wind carried the faint whistle of the mountain ridges. He lifted the hood. Steam curled out like a fading breath. While searching for a wrench, his hand brushed against something wedged behind the seat, an old canvas pouch, stiff with age. He frowned, tugged it loose, and brushed the dust off. Inside were yellowed papers and a sealed envelope stamped Greene County Office of Land Management. The postmark was nearly a year old. He tore it open. The paper inside was stiff, cold from the metal zipper. Notice of abandoned property. Parcel 982 Morgan Hill. Structure condemned. Demolition pending 60 days from date of notice. He read it twice, though once was enough. The words hit harder than they should have. Morgan Hill. He hadn't said that name in 10 years. Even thinking it felt like reopening an old wound that had only just stopped bleeding. The smell of smoke rose in memory. Sharp, oily, final. Shadow nudged his elbow. Jake glanced down. "Yeah," he murmured, voice low. "That place." He could still see Noah's grin if he tried, the way his younger brother had looked at 16, all sunburnt skin and wild hair that refused to lie flat, running barefoot through the tall grass by the creek. Noah had been the fearless one, always pushing too close to the edge, always trusting Jake to keep him safe. That night, the fire had taken him before Jake could reach the door, and Jake had carried that failure every mile since. A car horn startled him from the memory. A dented sedan slowed beside the shoulder. The window rolled down, revealing a woman with flushed cheeks and gray streaks escaping from under her knit cap. "You need a hand, mister?" she asked, voice carrying the calm drawl of someone used to these mountains. Jake squinted against the glare of snow. "Truck's dead. Might be the alternator." The woman leaned closer. "Or the fuel line. Froze. Happens every winter up this stretch. You local?" "Used to be," Jake said. She smiled faintly. "Guess that makes two of us. Martha Dillard." She reached into the passenger seat and handed him a thermos. "County maintenance. Coffee strong enough to wake the dead." Jake hesitated, then took it. The metal was warm against his glove. "Appreciate it." Martha nodded toward the north. "Morgan Hill's a lonely road, especially this time of year. You sure you're headed there?" "Not sure about much lately," he said. She studied him for a moment, something soft passing through her gray eyes. "Well, keep that dog close. Roads up there, remember things folks forget." Then she drove off, her tail lights fading into white. Jake stood in silence a moment longer, then patted Shadow's flank. "Looks like fate's got a cruel sense of humor, huh?" He tried the ignition again. Nothing. Eventually he loaded his pack, shouldered it, and began walking north. Shadow followed close, paws sinking into the powdery snow. By midday the clouds thickened into gray stone. They passed an old sign half buried by frost. Fairpoint, Pop, 982. The gas station at the edge of town was the only sign of life. Jake pushed the door open. A small bell chimed weakly. Inside, a heater rattled near the counter, doing more groaning than heating. The man behind it was in his early 60s, heavyset, wearing a red plaid jacket and wire-rimmed glasses. His name tag read Roy. He looked up from a magazine and raised an eyebrow. "Afternoon? You look like you fought a snowstorm and lost." Jake chuckled once. "Truck broke down, 10 miles south." "Rough spot to die," Roy said, folding his magazine. "Need a tow?" "If there's one nearby." Roy nodded. "Pete Langley's got a yard just up the road. He's meaner than Winter, but fair if you're straight with him." He leaned forward, studying Jake. "You headed somewhere in particular?" "Morgan Hill." That got Roy's attention. "Well, hell. Haven't heard that name in years. You one of the Morgans?" "Used to be." Roy's tone softened. "Heard about the fire. Folks still talk about that night. I'm sorry." Jake nodded once, jaw tight. Roy scribbled on a scrap of paper. "Here, Pete's number. Tell him Roy sent you. He won't charge double if he knows me." He looked at Shadow, who sat calmly by the door. "Fine-looking dog, loyal sort." "The best," Jake said. An hour later, the tow truck arrived, a battered red Chevy with the paint peeling around the edges. The driver, Pete Langley, climbed out, his tall frame slightly hunched from years of heavy work. His gray hair was tied back, and a cigarette dangled from his lips. His face was long, sharp-nosed, eyes as cold as the wind. "Roy called," Pete said. "You heading to Morgan Hill?" "Yeah." Pete let out a low whistle. "That road's cursed, or so they say. Snow, buries it every year. Folks don't go up there no more." Jake's expression didn't change. "It's mine. I've got to see it." Pete shrugged. "Your call, but I'll only take you to the fork. Past that, it's four-wheel drive or foot." The ride was quiet except for the sound of chains clinking on the tow rig. When they reached the turnoff, Pete stopped the truck and killed the engine. The forest ahead loomed like a wall of white and silence. He looked over at Jake. "You sure this is worth it, son?" Jake unbuckled his seatbelt. "It's all that's left." Pete nodded slowly, flicked the ash from his cigarette, and said, "Then may the road be kinder to you than it's been to most." Jake stepped down, slung his pack over his shoulder, and looked north. The trees rose high and skeletal, each branch heavy with snow. Shadow stood beside him, ears forward, steady as ever. Jake took one slow breath and whispered, "If I'm going to lose everything, might as well lose it where it began." And together, man and dog started the climb toward the place that still held the echoes of fire and home. By the time Jake reached the foot of Morgan Hill, dusk had already drained the world of color. The road turned into a narrow path of ice and silence, curling through the forest like a frozen scar. Shadow trotted ahead, his black and tan fur blending into the dusk, the crunch of his paws the only sound in that still wilderness. Snow weighed heavy on the pines. The air smelled of pine resin and something older, the scent of forgotten winters. When the last turn opened to a small clearing, Jake stopped. There it was. The cabin. It stood at the edge of the ridge, half hidden behind a cluster of oaks and birch, the kind that moaned in the wind. It wasn't the ruin he had feared all these years, but time had left its fingerprints everywhere. The once yellow walls were gray now, scarred with long streaks of soot. The left side of the roof sagged inward, shingles missing like teeth. The front steps were warped, and frost bloomed across the windows like cataracts. But it still stood, stubborn, wounded, alive. Jake's breath came out slow, fogging the air. His boots sank into the snow as he stepped closer. The silence deepened, as if even the forest held its breath. He reached the porch. His hand hovered above the doorknob, a simple brass knob, dulled by weather and years. He remembered holding it once as flames licked through the cracks of the door. He remembered Noah's voice calling from inside. He remembered the sound of the roof collapsing before the world went red. He twisted the handle. The door creaked open. A wave of cold air and ash met him. Inside, dust floated in the dying light, the moat swirling like smoke. The floor was littered with debris, splinters, bits of charred timber, a few broken jars glinting in the corners. He stepped in, each board groaning under his weight. The walls were streaked with black soot, but the structure itself had survived. The fireplace was cracked but intact, the iron grate warped, yet still recognizable. Shadow entered first, sniffing every inch, tail lowered but calm. He padded toward the center of the room and, after a long moment, sat down, curling his body neatly over his paws. His eyes lifted to Jake as if to say, "This will do." Jake set down his pack and knelt beside the old hearth. A faint smell of smoke still lingered, not sharp and new, but ghostly, as if time itself hadn't let it go. He brushed a layer of dust from the mantel and found a small, half-burned photograph wedged between two stones. The edges were curled, the surface marred with soot, but he could still make out Noah's grin, bright, careless, alive. His throat tightened. He turned the photo over in his hand and whispered, "Lan nai tau se kong bo ji nua." He built a small fire with the dry scraps he'd carried from town, coaxing flame from the flint. The cabin filled with flickering orange light, the shadows dancing over the walls. Shadow lay near the door, ears twitching, but eyes closing, slowly, trusting the warmth. Jake stretched out on the cold floor beside his pack, staring at the roof beams above. There were gaps large enough for the wind to sing through, but the sound was strangely comforting. Sleep came slowly. It wasn't peace, it was exhaustion. But for the first time in years, he didn't dream of fire. When dawn came, pale and brittle, the light slanted through the broken windows. Jake stirred, his breath rising in faint plumes. Shadow was already awake, sitting by the door, watching the forest like a guard on silent duty. Jake rubbed his stiff shoulders, pulled on his gloves, and stepped outside. The morning was colder, the air sharp as glass. He looked over the clearing, snow piled against the old fence line, the outline of what had once been a garden buried under frost. Beyond it, a frozen stream traced through the woods like a silver vein. He could still see the faint remains of the tool shed where his father used to store firewood, now just a frame, caved in under snow. He took a deep breath and said quietly, "All right, let's get to work." He started by clearing the porch, kicking aside the broken boards and sweeping away ash. The hammer from his pack felt right in his hand again, a memory of the life he'd lost, a rhythm he hadn't forgotten. Every swing echoed across the trees. Shadow followed him from room to room, sometimes nudging at piles of junk, sometimes lying near the fire when Jake returned to rest. Around midday, he found an old tin box under the floorboards, rusted but still sealed. Inside were a few letters, a silver lighter engraved with the initials N.M., and a tarnished pocket knife. He turned the lighter over in his palm and felt something stir. Noah's old lighter, the one he used to carry everywhere, the one Jake had searched for after the fire. He flicked it open. The flint was dead, but the sound, that sharp metallic click, hit something deep. The cabin seemed to breathe with him. As the day passed, he discovered more pieces of the life he'd lost. A cracked mug, a horseshoe nailed above the doorway, a child's drawing of 2 stick figures and a dog. He didn't remember drawing it, but the handwriting said, Jake plus Noah. He smiled faintly. You always had the better handwriting, kid. By late afternoon, his arms ached, his clothes were streaked with ash, and his breath came in white bursts. But there was a small, clear patch of floor now, swept, solid, ready. He set up his sleeping bag near the fire and took out a can of beans from his pack. Shadow watched him, tail flicking. Jake opened the can, poured half into a tin bowl, and slid it toward him. Dinner for 2. The dog ate quietly, glancing up every few seconds. When they were done, Jake leaned back against the wall and stared at the fading light outside. A crunch of footsteps in the snow made him sit upright. Shadow growled low, ears snapping forward. Jake grabbed the nearest tool, the hammer, and waited. The door creaked open, and a man's voice called out, "Whoa there! Easy!" The stranger stood at the threshold, bundled in a brown canvas coat dusted with snow. He was tall, in his mid-50s, with a rough beard and kind eyes set deep in a face lined by years outdoors. His hands were raised, palms open. "Didn't mean to scare you," the man said. "Name's Hank Grady. I keep an eye on these woods for the county. Saw the smoke and thought maybe the forest had caught fire." Jake lowered the hammer slowly, but stayed cautious. "You're a ranger?" "Used to be. Now I'm just the old guy who makes sure nobody gets lost." Hank smiled faintly, stepping closer. "You must be one of the Morgans." Jake hesitated. "Used to be." "Thought so. Knew your old man. Stubborn as oak. Good man." Hank looked around the cabin. "Didn't expect to see anyone trying to bring this place back." "Just cleaning up," Jake said. Hank nodded, reading more in the man's tone than the words. "If you're staying, you'll need better insulation before the next storm. And watch the chimney. Cracks like that'll smoke you out." "I'll manage," Jake said. Hank studied him a moment, then glanced at Shadow, who sat stiff and watchful by the hearth. "Fine dog. Shepherd, right?" "German Shepherd," Jake replied. 6 years old, named Shadow. Hank chuckled. "Fitting name? Smart eyes, too. He's reading me right now, isn't he?" Jake's mouth curved slightly. "Always does." Hank adjusted his gloves, then said, "If you need supplies, stop by my place 2 miles south, near the river bend. Folks out here don't talk much, but we don't turn away a man trying to fix what's broken." "Appreciate that," Jake said quietly. Hank tipped his hat. "You'll do fine, Morgan. Just don't let the ghosts do the talking." Then he turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving behind only the sound of his boots crunching in the snow. When the forest fell silent again, Jake closed the door, fed the fire, and sat beside Shadow. Outside, the wind rose and fell like the tide. Inside, the warmth spread slowly through the cracks. He looked at the photograph on the mantel, at Noah's smiling face half lost to the burn marks, and whispered, "We're home now, kid." The days that followed blurred into the rhythm of work and silence. Morning light leaked through the holes in the roof, spilling across the floorboards like liquid gold, and each sunrise brought the same cold promise. One more day to rebuild. Jake rose early, his breath clouding in the air, hands stiff from the night chill. He worked methodically, as he always had, measuring, cutting, hammering, his movements slow but precise. The sound of metal striking wood echoed across the ridge like a heartbeat that refused to die. The cabin had begun to change, bit by bit. New beams replaced the burnt ones. The roof no longer sagged as much. Smoke rose from the chimney each morning, curling lazily into the air, like a sign that something living had returned to the hill. Shadow followed Jake's every step, the dog's black and tan coat now dusted with sawdust. He watched each motion carefully, sometimes sitting in the doorway, sometimes nudging the hammer with his nose, as if helping. By noon, Jake's arms were raw from the cold. His jacket was damp with sweat, his gloves torn. He paused to catch his breath, leaning on the half-fixed railing. The forest around him was silent except for the distant crack of ice shifting in the river below. He bent down to lift another plank, but the world tilted. His knees buckled. He caught a glimpse of the pale sky spinning. Then everything went dark. When he woke, the fire was burning again. A wool blanket was tucked around his shoulders, and the sharp scent of pine and old soap filled the room. He blinked, disoriented. Shadow lay beside him, tail thumping gently, eyes calm. Then a voice, low, slow, and touched with a gentle rasp, spoke from near the door. "Easy now. You've been out a while." Jake turned his head. Standing near the hearth was a woman in her early 60s, wrapped in a heavy brown coat and a knitted scarf that had seen better years. Her silver-gray hair was tied in a loose bun, and her face was lined but kind, the sort that carried both sorrow and patience. Her hands were weathered, with the strength of someone who'd spent a lifetime working rather than waiting. She held a tin cup of steaming water, the scent of mint and smoke rising from it. "I heard the hammering," she said softly. "Didn't expect anyone up here. Then I saw the smoke and came to look." Jake pushed himself up slowly, head pounding. "How long was I out?" "Not long," she said, walking closer. "Long enough for the snow to stop. You were burning up and shaking. Guess you've been skipping meals." He hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm fine. Just overdid it." She smiled faintly. "That's what they all say." Handing him the cup, she added, "Name's Clara Dawson. I live down the road, about 2 miles east. Used to be the Dawson farm, though most of it's just ghosts now." Jake nodded, accepting the drink. The warmth seeped into his hands. "Jake Morgan." Clara studied. Him, her eyes softening. "Morgan? From this hill?" "Yeah." Her lips parted slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. "I remember your folks. Your father helped my husband put up the barn before the flood took it. That was a long time ago." Jake gave a small nod. "Feels like another lifetime." Clara's gaze drifted to the walls, tracing the charred lines that still marred the wood. "Fire, wasn't it?" He said nothing. She didn't push. Instead, she set a small basket on the table, a loaf of bread wrapped in cloth, a jar of honey, and a few old nails tied with twine. "You'll need these more than I do." "You didn't have to." "I did," she said gently. "No one should freeze alone up here." There was a moment of quiet. The fire cracked softly. Shadow rose, padding over to her. He sniffed her boots, tail wagging cautiously. Clara reached down, slow and careful, letting him decide. When the dog finally pressed his head against her hand, she smiled. "Well," she whispered, "you've got good instincts, don't you?" Jake watched, something easing in his chest. He doesn't usually warm up to people that fast. "Dogs know," she said simply. "They always do." As the light faded, Clara stayed to help him fix a few boards near the window, working with practiced ease. She wasn't tall, barely reaching his shoulder, but she carried herself with quiet strength. Every move was deliberate, steady. When she hammered, she didn't hesitate, her grip sure. Jake noticed the small gold band she still wore on her left hand, dulled by years of wear. At one point, he asked softly, "You got family nearby?" She paused before answering. "Had. My boy Michael served overseas, Iraq, never came home." Jake froze. The hammer in his hand stilled. "I'm sorry." Clara nodded once, eyes distant. "That was 15 years ago. The house got too quiet after that. Guess I just kept moving so it wouldn't swallow me." Their eyes met briefly, one haunted by fire, the other by sand and loss. And for a moment, neither spoke. Then she looked away, wiping her hands on her coat. "Storm coming tomorrow. You should seal that roof by nightfall." "I'll try." "You'll do more than try," she said, smiling faintly. "You've got the look of someone who doesn't know how to stop." When she left, the forest had turned silver in the moonlight. Shadow followed her to the path and watched until her figure disappeared among the trees. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He lay on the floor near the fire, staring at the ceiling, thinking of her voice, of the way she spoke about loss without breaking. He envied that steadiness. His own grief still came like waves, sudden, merciless, leaving him gasping. By morning, he was back at work, driven harder than before. The storm hit at noon, thick snow and biting wind, but he kept going. Between hammer, strikes, he thought of Clara's words. "You don't know how to stop." Shadow stayed close, his fur dusted white. Every so often he'd glance at Jake as if reminding him to breathe. A few days later, Clara returned. She arrived with another bundle, more bread, a thermos of soup, and a handful of nails in her coat pocket. She didn't ask if she could help. She just picked up a plank and started holding it steady while he worked. "Didn't expect company," Jake said, voice muffled behind his scarf. "Didn't ask," Clara replied with a faint grin. "Besides, I like the sound of a hammer better than the sound of a clock." By the third day, Shadow no longer barked when she came. He met her at the edge of the clearing, tail wagging slowly, nose brushing her hand in greeting. Jake caught himself smiling more often too, small, fleeting smiles that came when he wasn't thinking about it. At sunset one evening, Clara stood beside him, looking at the repaired roof. The light caught the streaks in her hair, turning them almost gold. "Your brother would be proud," she said quietly. Jake's jaw tightened. "You don't know that." "I don't have to," she replied. "I can see it." He didn't answer, but for the first time, he didn't turn away from the memory. That night, as the wind howled outside, he sat by the fire and watched Shadow sleeping near the hearth. The flames painted the room in shades of amber and gold. For the first time in years, the cabin felt like a home, not a grave. The storm came like an uninvited memory. By dusk, the wind howled across Morgan Hill, shaking the trees and scattering snow in wild spirals. The sky was a slab of iron, and the cabin creaked under its weight. Jake had sealed the roof days earlier, but the gaps still sang with every gust. Inside, the fire flickered weakly, struggling against the drafts that clawed through the cracks in the walls. He sat on the edge of his cot, staring into the flames, the hammer still in his hand. The light danced across the rough planes of his face, the short beard flecked with gray, the faint scar that ran along his jawline from his time overseas. His eyes, always distant, carried the hollow glaze soldiers sometimes brought home, the one that said part of them never made it back. Shadow lay curled near the hearth, head resting on his paws. The dog was still, but his ears twitched with every groan of the wind. Jake glanced at him. "You hear it too, huh?" he murmured. The dog didn't move. Outside, the storm roared louder, the sound merging with something deeper, something that belonged not to the present, but to another place. The echo of explosions, the smell of burning sand, the sound of men shouting in the dark. Jake's hand tightened on the hammer. His breath quickened. The cabin walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching long and sharp. He stood suddenly, as if ready for a fight. The fire snapped behind him, sending sparks upward. The wind slammed the door once, twice, and then again, louder, like fists pounding. "Get back!" he shouted. Shadow jumped up, alert. Jake's pulse thundered in his ears. The walls weren't wood anymore. They were metal. The hiss of snow became the scream of mortar shells. He smelled oil, gunpowder, sweat. He stumbled backward, knocking over a chair. The hammer fell from his hand and clanged against the floor. The storm pressed harder, and the sound of the door rattling became unbearable. He shouted again, words lost to the wind, and then the world narrowed to breath and panic. Shadow lunged forward. The German shepherd hit him square in the chest, pushing him down. Jake gasped, thrashing at first, but the dog didn't bite or bark. He pinned Jake's shoulders with his weight, pressing down firmly, steady as a rock. Shadow's nose touched Jake's cheek, his chest rising and falling in the calm rhythm, eyes fixed on his. The same maneuver he had been trained for years ago, to ground, to anchor, to bring a man back when his mind ran away. Jake's breath slowed, bit by bit. The storm outside raged on, but inside, another kind of storm began to break. His vision cleared. He blinked up at the ceiling, the hammer lying just inches from his hand. Shadow stayed still until Jake's heartbeat steadied. Then, with a soft whine, he stepped back, curling up at Jake's side, as if guarding him from the ghosts that lingered in the corners. Jake sat there for a long time, shaking, staring at the fire. His hands trembled, and when he finally lifted one to his face, he realized it was wet, not from snow, but from tears. He hadn't even noticed them fall. By morning, the storm had quieted. The world outside was blank and silent, buried in white. Jake's cabin looked like a shipwreck frozen mid-wave, snow piled high against the walls, icicles hanging from the eaves like teeth. He was still sitting by the fire when the sound of boots crunching through snow reached his ears. Shadow perked up first, tail twitching once in recognition. The door opened, and Clara stepped inside, brushing snow off her shoulders. Her cheeks were red from the cold, her breath puffing like smoke. The cabin was a mess. Tools scattered across the floor, a broken chair, the table half flipped. She looked at it all, and then at him, sitting quietly, eyes hollow, his hands raw and blistered. Clara didn't ask what happened. She just took a slow breath, walked to the hearth, and began stacking more wood onto the fire. The flames rose, soft and steady. She glanced at the kettle hanging over the embers, added water, and said, "Storm must have been rough." Jake didn't answer. After a moment, she spoke again, not looking at him, just watching the fire catch. "You know, Jake, sometimes God doesn't calm the storm. Sometimes he just teaches us how to build stronger roofs while it rages." Her tone wasn't sermon or pity, just truth, worn smooth by age and grief. Jake's throat worked before words came. "I thought I was past it." "You never get past it," Clara said quietly. "You just learn to live through it again." He looked at her then. In the morning light, her face showed its years, fine lines like rivers etched into her skin. But her eyes were steady, bright in a way that no storm could dull. He realized she wasn't talking about him alone. Shadow moved closer to her, resting his head on her knee. Clara smiled and scratched behind his ear. "He's a good one. Saved you, didn't he?" Jake nodded, voice rough. "He did." They worked together in silence for the next hour, clearing the mess. Clara swept the floor while Jake righted the chair, hammered a few loose boards, and mended what he could. When they were done, she handed him a mug of hot tea, her own trembling slightly from the cold. "You should let folks help you, Jake," she said gently. "No one gets through a storm alone." He stared into his mug. "I wouldn't know where to start." "You just did," she said. For a long time, they sat side by side, listening to the wind soften against the eaves. Outside, the snow began to glitter as the sun broke through the clouds. Inside, the air felt warmer, not from the fire alone, but from something unspoken, fragile, and human. Over the next few days, Clara stayed longer at the cabin. She brought tools, spare cloth, and food from her pantry. Sometimes she hummed while she worked. Old hymns, quiet and off-key. Jake found himself joining her without meaning to, tapping along to her rhythm as he hammered or sawed. The cabin's scars began to fade beneath new wood. At night, when the cold crept back and the wind began its low song through the trees, Jake would glance at Shadow, sleeping near the hearth, at the light flickering over the repaired walls, and feel something close to peace. It wasn't the absence of pain. It was the knowledge that, somehow, he could live beside it, and that, he thought, might be enough. The snow began to lose its grip on Morgan Hill. The air, once sharp enough to bite, had softened into something almost gentle. The roof of the cabin now shed water instead of snow, the sound of melting icicles tapping the window panes like quiet applause. For the first time since Jake had returned, color was creeping back into the world, pale greens beneath the drifts, the smell of thawing soil. Winter wasn't gone, not yet, but it was loosening its hold. Jake stood on the porch one morning, mug of coffee steaming in his hands. He had shaved that week, not clean, but enough to remind him he was still human. His brown hair, flecked with silver, caught the light, and for a moment he looked almost younger, almost like the man he had been before. Sand and fire and guilt hardened him. Shadow sat nearby, head tilted toward the woods, nose twitching at every whisper of wind. Clara arrived later that morning, her coat unbuttoned for the first time since the storm. She carried a small bundle wrapped in burlap and tied with twine. "You're up early," she said, stepping onto the porch. Her cheeks were pink from the climb, and strands of her silver hair fluttered free from her scarf. "Couldn't sleep," Jake said. "The quiet feels strange when you're used to wind." Clara smiled. "Quiet's just the world catching its breath." She placed the bundle on the table and opened it. Inside lay a round cushion made from thick, patched fabric, the kind once used for old coats. The stitching was uneven but sturdy. "Made this for Shadow," she said. "Couldn't let him keep sleeping on those boards." Shadow approached, sniffed the cushion, and, after a moment's inspection, circled twice before settling down on it with a long sigh. His tail thumped once, slow and content. Jake chuckled, shaking his head. "That's approval, in case you were wondering." Clara folded her arms, pretending to look offended. Well, I should hope so. It's been years since I sewed for anyone but myself. The warmth between them hung in the air like a soft fire. Outside, the snow continued to melt, revealing the stubborn shapes of roots and stones long buried. The forest was stirring again. That afternoon, Jake carried his tools to the clearing behind the cabin, the place where the fire had once burned hottest. The ground there was bare now, streaked with black earth and patches of green moss. Clara followed, holding a small sapling in her hands, a young oak, thin but straight, its roots wrapped in burlap. Found it growing near my fence, she said. Figured it deserved a better home. Jake looked at the tree, then at the charred stump a few feet away. He could still see the faint carving in the old bark, the letters J+N, half eaten by fire but still visible if you looked close. He swallowed hard. Noah carved that, he said quietly. Said he wanted to leave proof we existed. Guess he did. Clara set, the sapling down, gently beside the stump. Then let's give him something new to share the hill with. They worked together in silence. Jake dug while Clara held the sapling steady, her hands gloved but still trembling slightly with age. The soil was cold and heavy, but each shovelful felt like an offering. When they finished, Jake packed the earth around the base and stepped back. The little tree stood firm, its fragile branches trembling in the breeze. Looks small now, Clara said softly. But give it time. Oaks remember who plants them. Jake's eyes glistened. Maybe that's what I've been afraid of, being remembered for the wrong things. Clara looked at him for a long moment before answering. Then plant something better. That's all any of us can do. Shadow barked once, as if agreeing. They stood together until the light began to fade, watching the sapling's thin shadow stretch across the snow. Jake could almost imagine Noah there beside him, laughing, barefoot, tossing acorns like stones. But this time, the memory didn't burn. It only ached. That evening, as Clara brewed tea inside, Jake sat at the small desk he had built from salvaged planks. The firelight painted everything in gold. He took out a notebook, one of the few things that had survived the years untouched, and began to write. At first, his handwriting wavered, unsure, like a voice long unused. But the words came slowly. Manual for coming home. He wrote about simple things, how to keep a cabin warm with half the wood you think you need, how to build a door that won't freeze shut, how to keep fear from building walls thicker than the ones you live behind. He wrote about Shadow, the way the dog's steady breathing could calm him when nightmares clawed through the dark. And he wrote about Clara, her quiet strength, her way of showing kindness without making it sound like pity. It wasn't a book anyone else would ever read. It was a map, really, one that led back to himself. As the fire crackled, Clara sat by the window mending an old scarf. You writing something important? She asked. Just notes, he said. Things I wish I'd known sooner. She smiled without looking up. That's what wisdom usually is. Notes we write too late for ourselves, but just in time for someone else. Jake looked at her, the corners of his mouth lifting. Maybe, or maybe it's just me trying to make sense of what's left. Clara folded the scarf neatly in her lap. Then you're doing just fine. Outside, the forest glowed faintly under a sky of soft gray. The snow reflected the last of the evening light, and for the first time, the hill no longer felt haunted. It felt alive. Later, when Clara had gone home and the fire burned low, Jake sat near the hearth with Shadow curled at his feet. The dog's new cushion was already covered with fur, his paws twitching slightly as he dreamed. Jake watched him, smiling faintly. You look more at peace than I've ever been, he whispered. Shadow's tail flicked once, a small, sleepy answer. Jake leaned back, eyes on the ceiling, listening to the crackle of the fire and the quiet creak of wood settling, the sounds of a house breathing again. He thought of the tree outside, of the notebook waiting on his desk, and of Noah's laughter carried faintly on the wind. Maybe this is home, he said softly. Not the place, the choosing to stay. The fire dimmed and the hill outside fell into silence. But in that silence, something new had taken root. Spring came quietly to Morgan Hill. It did not arrive with flowers or fanfare, but with the slow surrender of ice. The air carried the faint scent of wet earth, and the mornings began to hum again. The drip of thawing snow, the the rustle of birds testing their voices after a long silence. The cabin, once gray and lifeless, now stood warm under a soft sun, smoke curling lazily from its chimney. For the first time in years, the place seemed to inhale and exhale like something alive. Jake knelt near the porch, sleeves rolled up, hands deep in damp soil. His fingers were scarred and rough, but they worked with a calm rhythm. A wooden crate beside him held small seed packets, most of them worn and faded. Clara sat on the steps behind him, her coat folded neatly beside her, her gray hair caught by the breeze. She wore a wide-brimmed straw hat that made her look younger, almost playful. "Tomatoes, carrots, beans," she said, reading from a seed bag, her voice slow and musical. "You're starting small, but small's how it sticks." Jake smiled without looking up. "You sound like my old sergeant." "I'll take that as a compliment," Clara said, handing him another packet. "He must have been a smart man." "He was," Jake replied, pressing his thumb into the dirt. "Died thinking he wasn't." Clara fell quiet for a moment. Then she said softly, "Sometimes the ones who save others forget they deserve saving too." He didn't answer. The wind carried the smell of pine and wet moss, and Shadow chased something invisible along the tree line, barking once, sharp and joyful. The cabin's porch had been rebuilt the week before. Jake had sanded the new boards until they gleamed faintly under the morning light. The walls had been patched, the windows replaced with clean panes that reflected the woods outside. What had once been a ruin was now a home that breathed warmth and light, with the faint scent of sawdust still clinging to it. Clara had started visiting almost daily now. She brought seeds, coffee, and the occasional jar of preserved peaches from her cellar. Her presence had become part of the place, a voice that filled the silence without crowding it. That afternoon, as they worked, Jake mentioned something he hadn't said aloud before. "I've been writing again," he said, glancing toward the open cabin door where his notebook rested on the table. Clara's brow lifted. "That manual of yours?" He nodded. "Finished a few pages last night. Thought maybe I'd post some of it online. There's this forum for veterans, PTSD support mostly. Used it back when things got bad." Clara smiled. "Then you know there's someone out there who needs to read it. I don't want to sound like I'm preaching." "You won't," she said. "You'll sound like a man who's still here. That's what they need to hear." That evening, after Clara had gone and the hill had turned golden with the last light, Jake sat at the table with Shadow curled at his feet. The cabin hummed faintly with the sounds of spring. A soft creak in the rafters, a bird tapping against the window. He opened his laptop, the screen casting a pale glow over his face, and typed, "For anyone who ever came home and couldn't stay there. I built a cabin with what was left of me. It wasn't about wood or walls. It was about learning how to live beside the fire instead of inside it." He hesitated before hitting post. Then he did. The message went out into the quiet hum of the internet, lost among 1,000 others. He closed the laptop, poured himself a cup of coffee, and thought no more of it. But by morning, the world had changed. The post had spread. Dozens of comments, then hundreds. Words from strangers, some from halfway across the country. Veterans, nurses, spouses, people who had lost someone or lost themselves. "Thank you, brother. I thought I was the only one. Your words helped me get out of bed today. I needed to hear this." Jake scrolled through them slowly, his chest tightening in a way that felt almost painful, not from sadness, but from recognition. Clara arrived mid-morning as usual, a woven basket hooked over her arm. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, stepping inside. He turned the screen toward her. "People read it." Her eyes skimmed the messages, then returned to him, bright and wet. "Of course they did," she said softly. "You built more than a cabin, Jake. You built a door for others to walk through." He laughed, shaking his head. "It's just words." "So is a prayer," she said, smiling. "Doesn't mean it can't move mountains." Outside, Shadow barked from the clearing, a bright, playful sound that cut through the stillness. Jake glanced out the window. The dog was circling the small oak they'd planted weeks earlier, his paws kicking up bits of soft earth. The tree had sprouted its first green buds. Jake stepped out onto the porch, Clara following behind. The sunlight felt warmer than it had in months. Shadow bounded around the sapling again, tail wagging furiously, his deep bark echoing through the woods. "He knows," Clara said. "Knows what?" that this place is alive again. Jake smiled faintly. Guess we all needed proof. They stood there together, watching as the breeze lifted through the branches. The sound of the leaves was soft, like breathing. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and turned the hill gold, Jake sat by the fire again, notebook open. He added one last line beneath his notes. You don't rebuild what you lost. You build what you can live in again. He closed the book, laid it beside him, and reached down to scratch Shadow's ear. Maybe we're finally home, he said. The dog stretched out, eyes half closed, tail thumping once against the floor. Clara's laughter drifted from outside, mingling with the rustle of wind through new leaves. The cabin creaked softly, a sound not of old wood, but of something settling into life again. For the first time in a decade, Morgan Hill was breathing. By June, the woods around Morgan Hill were alive with color. The oaks and pines had filled out again, their leaves whispering in the breeze. Wildflowers spread like fire through the clearing, and the cabin, once gray and hollow, now stood proud, its porch lined with hanging jars of herbs Clara had planted in the spring. The air smelled of wood smoke, mint, and the faint sweetness of bread baking in the stove. Jake had never thought he'd see the hill look like this again. Some mornings, he woke before dawn and sat by the window, just watching the mist drift across the valley. He still bore the marks of winter, calloused hands, faint shadows under his eyes, but there was something steadier about him now. The tremors that once caught his breath at night had quieted. He worked slower these days, but with a purpose that felt whole. Shadow followed him everywhere, still strong, his coat glossy under the sun. The dog had learned to sleep through laughter now, not jump at sudden noise. Sometimes Jake thought that was the truest sign of healing, that they both could rest without waiting for something to break the silence. It was on one of those warm afternoons, when sunlight spilled through the trees in thin golden sheets, that a white SUV made its way up the hill. The tires crackled over the gravel path. Jake looked up from the porch, shading his eyes. Shadow barked once, not in warning, but in curiosity. Two people stepped out. The first was a woman in her 40s, tall, with dark skin and sharp, intelligent eyes. She wore jeans, hiking boots, and a navy jacket embroidered with the emblem of Veterans Outreach Alliance. Her hair was cropped close, silver streaks at her temples that gave her an air of authority and grace. Her name tag read, Director Evelyn Ross. The man beside her was younger, maybe early 30s, with a clean face, short blonde hair, and the kind of posture that still spoke of the military. His name was David Lee, and though his handshake was firm, his eyes flicked around the clearing as if the air itself carried ghosts. Mr. Morgan? Evelyn asked as she approached, her tone respectful but warm. Jake nodded, wiping his hands on his jeans. That's me. What can I do for you folks? Evelyn smiled. Actually, we're hoping it's the other way around. I think you already did something for us. She lifted a folder from under her arm and handed it to him. Inside were printouts, screenshots from the PTSD forum, hundreds of replies, reposts, and comments. Jake blinked. You read it? Read it? She laughed softly. Half the organization did. Your manual for coming home has been circulating for weeks now. It's reached veterans groups in 6 states. We wanted to ask your permission to adapt it for our recovery workshops. Jake's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He glanced at Clara, who had just stepped out from the cabin, wiping flour from her hands. She gave him a quiet, proud smile. I don't know what to say, Jake managed. Evelyn tilted her head. Say yes. He smiled faintly. I'll say yes, on one condition. Name it. Hold your first workshop here, he said, gesturing toward the cabin and the open field. Morgan Hill's got room, and I think the hill's ready to hold more than one story again. Evelyn exchanged a glance with David, who smiled for the first time. I think that's a deal. 2 months later, Morgan Hill was alive with sound again, but not the kind that hurt. Laughter, hammering, the scrape of shovels, and the hiss of campfire flames filled the air. The Veterans Outreach Alliance had set up tents near the tree line, and each morning, new faces arrived. Men and women in worn jackets, caps, and boots, each carrying the same kind of silence Jake once had. He met them one by one. There was Caleb Turner, a carpenter from Ohio, his hands shaking when he first held a hammer again. Maria Santos, a medic with kind brown eyes, who cooked for the group and refused to sit down until everyone else had eaten. Frank Delaney, 60 years old and still cracking jokes like it was oxygen, who carved birdhouses out of scrap pine and said, "Keeps my hands from remembering other things." Jake worked alongside them, teaching how to mend roofs, patch leaks, and split logs the right way. But what they were really building wasn't just walls. It was rhythm, trust, and the fragile idea that they could belong somewhere again. Clara watched from the porch most days, her knitting basket on her lap. Her face glowed in the afternoon light, lines softened by peace. Sometimes she would hum the same hymn she'd sung through winter, and the others would quiet just to listen. They called her Miss Clara, though she never asked for the title. She became the quiet heart of the place, the one everyone went to when words were too heavy. Evening after evening, Jake saw her and Shadow sitting side by side, both content in their own stillness. One night, when the workshop ended and most had turned in, Clara stayed behind by the fire. The moonlight turned her hair silver white. Jake brought her a cup of tea, steam rising in the cool air. "You ever think we'd end up here?" he asked. Clara smiled faintly. "No, but maybe we were always supposed to." She looked out toward the clearing, where the veterans' tents glowed faintly under the stars. "You gave them a reason to start again. That's the reward, Jake, not medals or money. It's when you help someone remember they're still worth saving." Jake nodded slowly. "You did that too." Clara's eyes softened. "Maybe, but I was just holding the light. You were the one who built it." That night, she fell asleep in her chair near the fire, her breathing steady, the faintest smile on her lips. Shadow curled at her feet, refusing to move. By dawn, the sky had turned pale gold. When Jake stepped out, the fire had gone out, and Clara still sat there, peaceful, her scarf slipping from her shoulder. It took him a moment to realize the stillness that hung around her wasn't sleep. He knelt beside her, his hands trembling. There was no fear, no grief like before, only an immense, quiet gratitude. She had gone as she had lived, gently, without a sound, surrounded by warmth, and the people she had once prayed would find their way home. That afternoon, Jake gathered the others. They stood together at the porch while the wind moved through the trees. He placed a small wooden plaque beside the door, carved by his own hand. The words were simple, burned into the grain with care. Rebuilt by faith, guarded by a friend. Shadow sat beside him, tail resting on his boot. The breeze rustled through the new oak tree in the clearing, its leaves shimmering under the sunlight. Jake looked toward the horizon. The valley below bathed in summer gold, the laughter of new life echoing faintly from the woods. For the first time, he understood what it meant to come home. Epilogue. The oak that watched them. All summer lingered long over Morgan Hill, turning the grass a deep gold and filling the air with the hum of crickets. The young oak tree in the clearing swayed gently under the sun, its leaves whispering in rhythms that sounded almost like prayer. Beneath its shade, Shadow lay with his head on his paws, watching the horizon as if guarding both memory and promise. Beyond the tree stood the cabin, steady, sunlit, alive, filled now not with echoes of sorrow, but laughter, hammers, and the soft murmur of people healing together. Jake stood on the porch, hands resting on the carved sign, rebuilt by faith, guarded by a friend. His heart was no longer a house of ashes. It had walls again, built by forgiveness, sealed by kindness, and held up by the steady love of those who chose to return instead of run. Morgan Hill had become more than a place. It was proof that broken things, when met with patience and faith, could rise again stronger than before. What began as one man's effort to face his ghosts had become a sanctuary for many, soldiers, wanderers, mothers, sons, each finding something of themselves in the rhythm of rebuilding. The miracle was not the cabin, it was the people, how they returned, how they forgave, how they dared to believe that life, like wood, could still be shaped again. And maybe that's what faith truly is, not waiting for storms to pass, but trusting that God can teach us to build through the rain. Each act of kindness, each word of encouragement, each prayer whispered for someone else. These are the beams and nails of a world worth living in. So, if you're watching this tonight and carrying your own weight of silence, remember, you're not beyond rebuilding. Even from the coldest winter, God can carve a spring. May the Lord bless you and your family with peace, strength, and steady light. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs hope today. Drop a comment below to tell us where you're watching from. Your words might be the light someone else has been waiting for. And if you believe in stories that heal, that remind us of faith, loyalty, and second chances, please like, share, and subscribe so these messages can keep reaching more souls. Miracles still happen, sometimes in silence, sometimes through a friend, and sometimes through a faithful dog waiting by the door.